This session is called Type, Antitype, Linotype, and Mistyped. I hope that we'll be able to put all that together before it's all over and you can see why we've gone in this direction. How many of y'all know what that is? Yeah, that is the Gutenberg press. Now I think it's really funny that you can find several different pictures of the Gutenberg press and none of them look alike. So there may be a little bit of a suspicion what one actually looked like, but this is a very early model, very old one, and it has the same principle. They all have the same arm that makes the printing. Johannes Gutenberg finished the first printing press in 1440. Prior to this invention, the Bible was hand copied from beginning to end. You know, scribes were actually paid to do this, and they were well paid, very well paid. And of course, what that means is that a book cost a fortune. To have the entire Bible would be the equivalent to a fairly good 1 year's salary if you were going to buy that book. We can hardly even put ourselves in that position today. This totally revolutionized the study and understanding of the Scriptures. We can't even think what it might have been like before the printing press. It's hard to conceive. Well, here's another picture, another press. Same general idea. You see at the very top there, where the arrow is pointing, the press had a plate, and that you had a different plate for each page. The plate would be then pressed. They'd move that arm and it'd press it against the paper, which would be at the bottom there. You'd put the paper in, slide it in, move the arm, come down, come back up, and then you do another one, because while you're at it, you might as well do two, or you do 5. And you could do several copies that way of the same page, and then you'd separate them all out, and you'd change the plate. New words, a new page, there's new artwork on the page. The books back then used to be really, really fantastic. But you can imagine that would be a laborious task, especially when you're printing maybe a 1,600, 1,800 page booklet or book. So it was a slow process, but this was so much quicker than hand copying them. Now, there's this thing called type. That's what they were putting. They discovered that they could put type into these blocks, and the type would be changeable then. So you could reuse the type. You wouldn't have to recarve a letter for each page, or you wouldn't have to take a page and then carve the whole page. You could actually take letters and exchange them just like we do with a typewriter, so to speak. You're just pushing the keys for the different letters. So the type could either be raised or indented depending on what you wanted to print. If you wanted to print so that the color of the paper was the color of the print, then you'd have it engraved into it. But if you wanted the letter to be the thing that is inked and the page to be the background, then you would have it raised. So the letters were either made from wood, which they would carve them out, or maybe from molten metal. And if they were made from a molten metal, they could actually remelt them and clean up a letter anytime they wanted to. If the letter got kind of nicked or something like that, they could just throw it in a pile and form another one. Then they could have a mold that would fit it. And so you didn't get a mold with the wood. You can't mold wood. Well, this is a linotype. Linotype. My grandfather was a printer. He was in a printing establishment in several states, actually, but he was in one in Louisville, which I was asked, maybe 8 to 10 years ago to come in and do some consulting work with. And while I know nothing about printing, I knew a little bit about OSHA requirements and things, and so I kind of worked on writing them manuals for safety manuals for using some of these old machines, because they were still using the old machines. They still had 5 or 6 linotypes, and they're probably the only linotypes in Kentucky. It's very important to use linotypes for some printing today. You know, a linotype is capable of doing all those graduation cards that everybody gets. You know, at graduation they get these little cards, and the only way you can set those up is with a linotype. It doesn't work well with anything else. You can't have raised letters if you use any other method. You photograph it and then it doesn't give you a raised letter. So some invitations and things like that look much better if a linotype did it. And so they still use the linotype, and this made them very, very busy during certain times of the year. Well, this machine is incredible. I wish I had it here to show you. In fact, they offered me my grandfather's old linotype. They just said, well, you can have that if you want. And I thought, where in the world would I put that? So my wife is very glad that I have not taken them up on that. But the linotype, the keyboard wasn't like your typewriter. It wasn't a QWERTY keyboard. And in fact, believe it or not, they designed the QWERTY keyboard to slow your fingers down. They needed to slow it down because since the keys were coming up like this, if you went too fast, they'd get locked. And so it had to be slow enough to where they would never get locked. And the old linotypes had the exact same layout as what they called the print. Well, I can't give you the name of it. It was cases that they put the letters in. Incidentally, if you've heard of uppercase and lowercase, that's where it comes from. They had a set of cases that had the alphabet up here, which were all capitals. They had another case down here with the non-capital letters. And so they were able to go and pull out those letters originally and just stick them on this board and then form them into a word. Then got to the linotype, and the linotype dramatically sped up the process. If it wasn't for the linotype, we would not have had newspapers on a daily basis. And you could just sit there and type, and then just these little metal pieces would come down, slide down into a tray, and it would just line up in order, and you'd have the words that you were typing. Molten lead would then come and pour into the section where your type had fallen. It would actually pour a little thing of lead, it would be encased, and it would be your letters. It would be raised letters. And lead cools down very quickly. And so it would spit out that bar of lead. You'd make one, it'd spit it out just about as quick as you'd make it. And then another one would come down. You'd be typing on the next line, and another molten lead would be poured out, and it'd fill that up, and then it'd spit that out as a solid bar. I usually bring one to show to you, but for some reason it didn't cross my mind this week. But here is one of those lead linotype things. Notice how thick it is. It's just real. It'll be about that thick, and it'll be about this thin. Kind of sounds strange to say it, about that high. And at the top of it, if you look at the very top, you will see those are the letters. This is all put into a clamp that then does the letters. Let me show you the clamp. Well, here's the cabinet that they store them in. If you ever want to reprint a story, see, they'd store them in a cabinet and in a drawer. That was a fun thing, because when I went there, they were cleaning out the drawers that they had saved over the years. And they showed me some things that my grandfather had done. Now, my grandfather died before I was born. So he died in 52, I think, or 53. And so that that kind of gave me a connection back to, my roots and seeing what he had actually done in the process. They probably melted down tons of lead. I don't think a tornado could have picked up that building. It was just loaded with this. Now this is the clamps that I was talking about. The type is locked into place with a series of clamps and then mounted to the printing press. This was a very heavy group of page. When they were making these presses, they were moving a whole lot of metal. It was incredible. So they have a key that they use to clamp it down, because think of what would happen. These presses, first of all, you got the paper down here, and with a mechanical press, they're just coming down like this. They're just going, pow, pow. They smack so hard because they have to make that image once. It comes back up, a roller goes over it, and then it comes back down and hits again for another page. Now that sounds like that must take, how many pages do you think they could print with that methodology in a minute? With it coming down like that. Said 5? Yeah, 5 would be a reasonable figure, but they were printing up to 1,000. That shows you how quick these machines were. You want to talk about noise. It was pretty incredible. Well, they have kept all these old machines and they haven't upgraded, so what they ended up doing was they started using these machines for dies. And you could put a big piece of cardboard in there that, for instance, if you were going to make a folder for some reason, they have to be folded, right? If you've ever gotten a folder that wasn't folded, you see that there are lines there. This is where it folds. It's indented. That's how they get them there, is by using these old presses, and they will put the lines in so that everything folds properly. Now, they have other methods of doing it, but the old presses can be converted to do that very easily, and it's kind of a cheap way to do a more expensive operation. So they ended up being the guys who put the lines in for all the printers. They were the printer's printer, because they would get all this work sent to them to do. Well, here's an old Kluge press. It shows the roller up at the top. You can see where the roller comes down. You see that round flat plate. That's where you would lock in that clamp, and it would roll that, and then it would come over and hit it. And notice those latex tubing. Now you probably can't tell it's latex, but they have little fingers that come down and pick up the page. It's with vacuum. So it picks up that page and moves it out of the way and stacks it, and it just keeps on stacking it. And all this is just done less than a second. They're just putting out some real papers. Now this will not go 1,000 pages a minute. It's a little slower process, but it still puts out an awful lot of printing. So the type is mounted on the press, then the plate is inked, pressed against the paper, and the printed page is stacked as a finished product. Think about handwriting every one of those. Wow. What an amazing invention. Of course, what I'm showing you is almost 100 years old. Okay, the type are the raised letters which are put on the press. That's what a type is. The antitype is the page in its completed form. So, the burning question is, which is the most important? The type or the antitype? You've got to realize the purpose, the reason, the focal point of this entire process is to get the antitype, not the type. The type is a means by which we get the antitype. We are looking for the antitype, not the type. So, handwriting is equivalent to the type. It's like saying, which is more important? The handwriting or the final product? We would all recognize that the Torah scroll was greater than the one etching every letter on there, or the process. We'll have to say the process, not greater than the one, because the individuals are more valuable. But that's something we have to get into our mind when we use these terms, because these terms are used all the time concerning scriptural matters. And unfortunately, we confuse them because we misunderstand these terms. Anti. Sounds like it's against, doesn't it? Okay, let me tell you what anti originally meant. And in fact, this may help you in other biblical questions. Anti, in the Greek, means in the image of. Okay? It doesn't mean against. Now, when the type came along, which incidentally I started with the Gutenberg press, the type was in the first century. The first type was the king's signet ring, where he would put on his ring and then embed it in the wax. You see, that's type. So this is a very old concept. I said the first century. It actually predated that many, many years. I'm just saying it was back during biblical times. Okay, so the type was really just conveying the message that the king had written the document. Did you know that recently they dug up in the Temple Mount one of those rings, signet rings of the high priest? And it's been about 3 or 4 years, but of the high priest, so that it was a seal that he had sent the message. And it was actually one of the priests in the Bible. So it was a direct connection to biblical things. We're going to switch gears here a little bit. We've talked about the type and the antitype, but we need to go a little bit further. I do want to tell you a little bit more about the type and the antitype. One thing is that the antitype, because of language and how it changes over time, the word anti, which meant in the image of, when it started coming into the typewriter and things like that in the printing press, what was it? It was the thing opposed. The opposite. Opposing can develop into against. So the language did change over time. Actually, even with the signet ring, the type and then the opposed page, the antitype, was there. That was the wax. Okay, so there was a hint of against, but it didn't mean opposing. And so that's something that has developed over the years, as in opposing to stop someone from doing it. We're going to go over another word that changed in the same manner in a later session. But anyway, to switch gears now, got a couple of movies here. I was required to watch one of them in psychology class when I was in high school. One, Jack Nicholson's film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That was a required watching. I remember when this happened, or when I was shown this film. Jack Nicholson, if I could remember it from my youth, it was basically a story of this reporter who decided that he was going to find out how they were treating the mentally insane. And so basically what he did is he checked himself into an institution. And, he had all these faculties and everything. He just wanted to see how they were treating the people who weren't completely there. It didn't matter whether they were retarded or whether they were somehow incapacitated because of mental disorder. They were all put in there. And so they had these institutions where they would kind of keep them in there like a prison and take care of them. The families could come and visit ever so often, but they were in the institution. Well, he got in there and he began to have a little bit too much fun for a reporter. He found that they were very easy to lead around and get into things. He led them in several things that were very disturbing to the psychologist. And of course, as he was doing these things, he was taking notes and writing about how the board reacted, and he was going to do a really good book on the subject. He got down to the end of the movie, and the doctors all were beginning to consider him a real troublemaker. And he was really having fun. He would just laugh about these things. And of course, he would try to make his laugh somewhat demented so it would go with his character in the movie. So anyway, you get down to the back of the ending of the movie, and you could tell that there were some plans going on to take care of the way he was dealing with stuff. And what they ended up doing was giving him a lobotomy, which meant they burnt his brain so that he was no more than a vegetable. With no one's permission. They didn't ask his family. They didn't ask anything because they had the authority to do it. Now, you want to talk about something, you really got to like this guy because you knew you could really identify with him. He was a practical joker. And at least I could identify with him. That was in my past life. I was a practical joker. Anyway, he gained your heart through the whole process, and then to see that done to him was just devastating. It's not a movie I recommend, although it's kind of a movie I recommend. That movie alone changed how they treated the mentally insane. It was like the people were outraged that this was going on. But see, one of the tricks of getting someone to understand your position is getting them to identify with you. Okay, they've got to identify with the injustice. And so that's what this movie did. It got you to identify with this reporter who had gone in to do this investigative process, and was going to expose what was going on. Then you see what happens to him, and you're just, oh my goodness. Well, then there was Tom Selleck. I was telling you that I worked for a printing establishment in Louisville. I had to go down for the week. It just didn't make sense for us for me to live here and then commute back and forth every morning. It's about a 2-hour drive, so that'd put 4 hours of driving a day. So I'd just go down there and stay, and the owner of the establishment was a very dear friend of mine, and so he just says, come stay at my house. Well, there were certain drawbacks that came from staying at his house. One of them is that he wanted me to see this movie, Not One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, An Innocent Man. He wanted me to see that. And he's paying your bill. It's really polite to at least look at the movie he wants you to see, right? And he'd go, Frank, I want you to see this movie. I go, nah, I don't care much for movies. I don't watch movies. I'd really like you to see this movie. Because he really wanted me to be outraged. So anyway, he finally says, let's drive over to Indiana for a few minutes. Because I got something I want you to see. And I thought, okay, so we get in the car and he goes over to the movie warehouse and checks out this movie. This is what I want you to see. Okay, so we're going to go home and watch this movie. It was An Innocent Man. In An Innocent Man, this person portrays an innocent man. He is someone who's just living his life, going on with no real problems, it doesn't actually give you a whole lot of his life. It just makes you feel like you can identify with the guy going to work, coming home. He comes home one night, and it turns out that the police have decided that they need to arrest a criminal. The guy is a murderer, and they know he's a murderer, and they have all kinds of things that makes them realize he's a murderer, but they don't have any evidence. You see, you have a problem when you don't have evidence, you can't convict him. And so they decided what they were going to do is that they were going to plant some drugs on him in an arrest. They would come in to arrest him, plant drugs, find drugs on him, and then have him arrested. Now, the thing that's very disturbing about this, and the reason my friend wanted me to see this, is he found out that the Louisville Police Department was doing this. And he got it from a policeman, how they were setting up things like this to get people convicted. And so he wanted me to see this movie so that I could identify with the guy, and it was a good way to get me on their side, which I would have been anyway. So in this movie, this innocent man lives in an apartment, and the police get the wrong address. And they have no idea. They've never seen the guy before. So they go in to this address in the middle of the night, arrest this guy, plant drugs on him, take him in to get him convicted. Book him. It's not the right person. Nobody knows that it's not the right person because everything's gotten so big that it's just numbers and things like that. So here he is, he's getting booked. Well, he's determined, I'm an innocent man. The justice system will work. Well, if you all have spent any time in the justice system of recent, you will know that there is some flaws, I'll say, in the justice system. Now, I'm not trying to knock judges here. I'm not trying to knock the police. But there are some flaws in the system. And it is not certain that justice will always come. There are many people who are locked up in jail who are totally innocent of what they've done, of what they're there for, at least. There are probably very few people who are totally innocent, but that's beside the point. Maybe we all deserve jail. But this guy was going to fight it, and he was going to plead not guilty all the way to the end, and they kept on trying to offer him a plea bargain, and he wasn't going to take this plea bargain because he was not guilty. So, what happens? The judge finds him guilty. He's thrown into jail. Gets like a 15-year sentence. And then the rest of the story was about him in jail and how jail, because of the system that's going on in the jail, you have like the criminals have their pecking order. And so it goes all the way down to the very end of the movie where he ends up killing a man in jail in order to stay alive to some extent. But it shows how the jail system is corrupting the people who are in there. You put them in on one charge and they're being corrupted to a much worse charge, and they get to the point to where they just don't care anymore. So, the movies An Innocent Man and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest were pictures that attempted to bring about social change. The first was an attempt to change a corrupt legal system, while the second wished to change the way America dealt with the insane. The purpose of these two movies was to increase social awareness on their topic, was to educate the public. Gandhi fought against the caste system in India, attempting to change the injustice that system created. Gandhi was a real person. I know they made a movie about him. The person in the movie wasn't the real person, but Gandhi was a real person. He suffered harm because it was real, the things that he did. And he was truly opposed by the British government in India. And he was truly thrown into jail. And even, I would call it persecution for the things that he was trying to do for the people in India. Martin Luther King fought against discrimination in America. He died trying to bring about equality for his people. Martin Luther King was a real person. Martin Luther King really died. It wasn't like the movies. The movies, Jack Nicholson got out of the insane asylum when the movie was over. Not at the end of the movie, but he was finished with his acting. And he went on to something else in his career. Tom Selleck did also. Martin Luther King didn't go on beyond the end of that story. You see, there's a difference when a real person has to deal with the injustice than just the movie. The movie was wonderful. The reality wasn't nearly as wonderful. So, which is greater? The allegory attempting to convey a message of social change, or the man who gave his entire life for social change? Does the movie make any tangible change in the practice of mankind? Yeah, the movie does bring awareness, and sometimes it brings people to go out and do something. But the movie still requires a man to step forward and demand and implement changes. You see, the movie can point out the problem, but still it requires humans to get up and do something about it. It's a good start, but it's definitely not a finish. Martin Luther King did what he did, and it was a finish for him. He gave up his life for it. Now, we could say, well, it wasn't directly related. You know, he wasn't killed for doing what he was doing. Well, yes, he was in some respects. The movie is more in line with the type, while the man giving up his life is closely related to the antitype. The antitype is always superior to the type. Does that make sense? Is there any intrinsic value in the movie? Intrinsic value. Embedded within? Not necessarily. The movie may clarify the specific need and even move public opinion to accept and implement change. But that isn't necessarily intrinsic value. So let's look at some types in Scripture. Joseph has been considered to be a type of Messiah in that he suffered so that his brothers could be saved from a terrible drought. Joseph was sold into slavery, falsely accused when he stood up for what was right, thrown into jail for those false accusations, and from there rose to the highest position in Egypt. The name Messiah, son of Joseph, in ancient Jewish Agadah, was coined as a title for the suffering servant Messiah, which portrayed a Messiah who would come, suffer, and die for the nation of Israel. In doing so, he would save them from perverse situations. Here the picture is given by the true story of Joseph, but the antitype is revealed in the New Testament, with Yeshua being a suffering servant as Yah's salvation for mankind. So you see, we look at what Joseph does and we say, this is a precursor, something that gives us a hint of what Yeshua was going to do. That's what we're calling a type. Joseph is the type. Yeshua is the antitype. King David is also considered a type of Messiah. He was a simple shepherd boy who trusted in the Lord and had no fear. He rose to be the anointed king over united Israel. Since David united a split kingdom, Messiah is expected to return the northern kingdom from their captivity, reunite the divided kingdom, conquer all their foes, and return the dominion of the earth to Jerusalem, ruling and reigning over the entire earth in truth and justice. It is apparent to the Messianic community that Yeshua came as the suffering servant Messiah, that is, Messiah, son of Joseph, but will return a second time as the ruling king Messiah.